The candlelight trembled across the Thornley dining room like living things uncertain of their purpose, casting shadows that danced and writhed along walls papered in imported damask the color of old wine. Crystal chandeliers hung heavy overhead, their prisms fracturing light into rainbow ghosts that played across the faces of Virginia's finest society as they raised silver forks to their lips and consumed what Jacob Brennan had prepared for them with such meticulous care. He stood in the doorway between the dining room and the service corridor, a figure of absolute stillness amid the animated conversation and clinking silverware. His dark hands, calloused from decades of service, held a silver carving platter with the same steady precision that had characterized every movement since the guests had arrived 3 hours earlier. But his eyes, those eyes that had learned long ago to show nothing, to become mirrors that reflected only what white folks wanted to see, those eyes now held something different. Something cold and vast and terribly satisfied. "Rutherford, I must insist you reveal your secret," Colonel Harwick Pemberton declared, gesturing with his fork at the meat on his plate. A piece of roast, perfectly browned and glistening with juices, was speared on the tines. "In 30 years of dining across Virginia, I have never encountered such exceptional fare. The texture is unprecedented, so tender it nearly dissolves on the tongue, yet with substance, with character." Master Rutherford Thornley beamed with the proprietary pride of a man who believed all excellence under his roof was ultimately his own achievement. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his grey mutton chops freshly oiled, his waistcoat straining slightly against a belly grown prosperous on the labor of the 200 souls he claimed as property. The golden light loved his face, softened the cruelty in his mouth. "You're too kind, Colonel," Rutherford said, though his tone suggested he believed kindness had nothing to do with accurate assessment. "I credit our good Jacob here. 15 years he's served this household, and I dare say he's learned a thing or two about preparation. Haven't you, boy?" Jacob inclined his head with the precise degree of deference expected. "Yes, Master Thornley. I done learned considerable about preparation." The words sat in his mouth like communion wafers, bland and meaningless to those who consumed them, but to Jacob they carried the weight of sacrament. He had indeed learned about preparation. 3 weeks of careful planning. 2 days of butchering in the isolated smokehouse beyond the blood orchard. Hours of cooking with rosemary from Genevieve's own garden, with thyme she'd cultivated to season the lamb she favored, with the same wine that now filled the crystal glasses before each guest. "But the breed must factor significantly," Judge Cornelius Ashford interjected, cutting another piece with his knife. The blade sank through the meat with almost no resistance, and when he brought the morsel to his lips, his eyes closed in evident pleasure. "Such marbling, such flavor. I don't recognize the varietal. Is it one of your experimental crossbreeds, Thornley? I know you've been working with your livestock." Rutherford chuckled, reaching for his wine glass. "Something like that, Judge. Something very special indeed. A one-of-a-kind specimen, you might say. Raised right here on Thornley soil, fed from our land. Local provenance through and through." Jacob moved forward then, silent as smoke, and refilled the judge's glass with Madeira that caught the light like liquid amber. His hand was steady. It had not trembled once all evening, not when he carved the roast before bringing it to table, not when he arranged it on the Thornleys' finest china with sprigs of fresh herbs, not when he watched these distinguished gentlemen and their wives consume piece after piece with such obvious satisfaction. Mrs. Cordelia William, whose ostrich plumes trembled in her elaborately coiffed hair each time she moved her head, pressed her napkin to her lips with a delicacy that suggested she believed refinement was measured in the smallness of one's bites. "It has such an unusual sweetness," she observed. "Almost like honey-cured ham, yet distinctly different. Elijah, you must have another helping. You look positively transported." Her husband, a portly merchant whose fortune in tobacco had purchased him entry to society's upper echelons, nodded enthusiastically. "I am transported, my dear. Transported entirely. Jacob, another serving if you please." "Yes, sir." Jacob glided to Mr. William's side, lifted the silver serving fork and knife with practiced grace, and laid another generous portion on the man's plate. The meat was still warm, still tender. He had timed everything perfectly, had calculated the temperature and duration to ensure each cut would melt on the tongue, would release its juices in a burst of flavor that would make these people, these fine, upstanding, Christian people, close their eyes in momentary bliss. "I confess myself puzzled by one matter," Reverend Josiah Blackwell said, his lean face thoughtful as he chewed. The Reverend was known for his fire and brimstone sermons about the natural order of things, about how the Lord had ordained some to lead and others to serve. "Where is your lovely wife this evening, Rutherford? I had so looked forward to complimenting Genevieve on this remarkable meal. Surely she supervised its preparation." The question hung in the air like the smoke from the candles, curling and dissipating into shadows. Jacob stood very still near the sideboard, his face a mask of polite attention, but inside him something shifted and settled with the weight of stones dropping into deep water. Rutherford's jovial expression flickered, just for a moment, before reconstructing itself. "Ah, yes. Genevieve sends her regrets. She's been indisposed of late, women's complaints, you understand. Her physician recommended a change of air. She's traveled to Charleston to stay with her sister for a few weeks. The sea air," he said, "would do her constitution good." "I do hope it's nothing serious," Mrs. Williams said with the performative concern of someone who secretly relished others' misfortunes. "She seemed in perfect health at the Ashfords' garden party just last month." "Perfect health indeed," Colonel Pemberton agreed. "In fact, I remarked to my wife how exceptionally robust Genevieve looked. Such color in her cheeks." Jacob could have told them about Genevieve's color. Could have described how the roses in her complexion had drained to chalk white when she realized she was alone with him in the blood orchard, how red had flooded back in the moments before the end. But he said nothing, merely moved along the table with the water pitcher, filling glasses that didn't need filling, performing the elaborate choreography of service that rendered him functionally invisible. "She's always been vigorous," Rutherford said, his voice carrying a note of something, was it unease, that Jacob alone seemed to detect. "Too vigorous sometimes, if I'm honest. The woman exhausts herself with managing the household, with overseeing discipline of the stock. I told her she needed rest." "Discipline," Judge Ashford said, nodding sagely. "Essential to a well-run property. My own overseer has been too lenient lately. I'm considering replacing him." "Genevieve never shirked from necessary discipline," Rutherford said, and there was pride in his voice now, the pride of a man whose wife understood that cruelty was just another word for proper management. "She maintained order with a firm hand." "Very firm." Jacob's own hands tightened imperceptibly on the pitcher handle. "Firm." Yes, Genevieve's hands had been firm when they'd gripped the whip. Firm when they'd seized his Clarissa by her thin arms. Firm until they weren't anymore, until they'd grown cold and stiff in the blood orchard where she'd spilled so much blood that the soil had turned black. "This roast truly is magnificent," the colonel said, returning to safer conversational territory. "I don't suppose you'd share the preparation method?" "My own cook is competent, but this is artistry." "Jacob?" Rutherford looked at him expectantly. "What's your secret?" Jacob moved into the candlelight, and perhaps it was a trick of the flickering flames, but his smile seemed different than the practiced expression of servility he'd worn for 15 years. It touched his lips but didn't reach his eyes, and in those eyes something ancient and implacable looked out at the assembled company. "Ain't no real secret, master," he said softly. "Just a matter of knowing your meat. Understanding where it come from, what it fed on, how it lived. You treat it with respect during the preparation, proper cleaning, proper seasoning, proper time in the heat. And you got to have the right disposition toward it. Got to approach the work with the right frame of mind." "Fascinating," the judge murmured. "The philosophy of cookery." "Some meat," Jacob continued, his voice still soft but carrying now to every corner of the room, "some meat got to be prepared with particular care. Especially when it's special. When it's precious. When it's something you've been thinking about for a long time." Mrs. William laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. "Why, Jacob, you're positively poetic this evening. Rutherford, you should send him to my kitchen to train my cook. Though I confess I'd be loath to share him. He's irreplaceable, Rutherford agreed, already reaching for another serving. Absolutely irreplaceable. We're fortunate to have him. The word, fortunate, rolled around the table like a marble seeking a place to settle. Jacob watched them eat. Watched silver knives saw through tender flesh. Watched teeth tear and tongues taste. Watched throats work as they swallowed what he prepared with such meticulous devotion. Clarissa had been 8 years old. 8 years old when Genevieve dragged her to the blood orchard for the crime of accidentally breaking a crystal decanter while dusting the parlor. 8 years old when she screamed for her father and he could not come, held by 2 overseers on Genevieve's orders, forced to watch as the mistress beat his daughter with a branch from the apple tree until the child's cries stopped and her small body lay still among the fallen fruit. To absent friends, Reverend Blackwell said, raising his glass. May Genevieve return to us soon, restored in health and spirits. To absent friends, the table chorused, crystal chiming against crystal. Jacob retreated to the shadows by the doorway as they drank. He had served dessert yet to bring out, a trifle made with cream and berries from the Thornley orchards, but for now he simply watched. Watched Rutherford take another helping, the man's jowls working as he chewed, his eyes half closed in satisfaction. Watched the colonel and the judge discuss crop futures and the price of cotton. Watched Mrs. William delicately dissect her portion into ever smaller pieces, making her pleasure last. They had consumed her almost completely now. Had taken Genevieve Thornley into themselves, had made her part of their own flesh. She who had been so proud, so beautiful, so certain of her dominion over everything and everyone on this plantation. She had become nothing more than sustenance for her peers, her substance transformed and redistributed among the people who had enabled her cruelty with their silence, who had turned blind eyes to the screams that sometimes carried from the blood orchard on humid Virginia nights. The candles burned lower. Wax dripped like tears down silver candlesticks. In the kitchen beyond, the other enslaved servants moved like ghosts, preparing coffee and port, none of them meeting Jacob's eyes when he passed through earlier. They knew something had changed in him. Could sense it the way animals sense approaching storms. Rutherford leaned back in his chair, patting his belly with both hands, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. A triumph, Jacob. An absolute triumph. I don't know when I've enjoyed a meal more thoroughly. Thank you, master, Jacob said from the shadows. I done put everything I had into it. Everything. And as Rutherford reached for one final piece, as his white fingers closed around the fork and raised it to his lips, Jacob allowed himself a thought that settled in his mind with the finality of a closing door. Let him feast. Let them all feast on what she became. If this story has already gripped you, subscribe now and comment below what you think happened to Genevieve Thornley. Your theories fuel these dark tales. 6 months earlier, the Virginia summer had pressed down on Thornley Plantation like a heated iron, the air so thick with moisture that breathing felt like drowning in small increments. Cicadas screamed their endless mechanical song from the tobacco fields, and the sun turned the sky into beaten copper that offered no mercy to those who labored beneath it. Jacob had been in the main house that day, polishing the silver tea service in the butler's pantry, when he heard Clarissa's scream cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through silk. He dropped the creamer he'd been buffing, silver clattering against the wooden counter, and ran. His heart knew before his mind did. Knew the particular pitch of terror in his daughter's voice, knew that something irrevocable was happening in the space between one breath and the next. The parlor was a tableau of destruction. Crystal shards glittered across the Persian rug like scattered diamonds, refracting the afternoon light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. The Waterford decanter, imported from Ireland at considerable expense, Genevieve's particular pride, lay in pieces beneath the side table where it had fallen from Clarissa's small, trembling hands. And Genevieve Thornley stood in the center of the room like an avenging angel rendered in ivory silk and fury. She was beautiful, Genevieve. Even Jacob, who had learned to see past the surfaces white folks presented, could not deny the classical perfection of her features. Hair like spun gold coiled in elaborate braids, porcelain skin that had never known a day's labor, eyes the color of a winter sky. 28 years old and mistress of 200 souls, she moved through the world with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied anything, who had never been told that cruelty had consequences. "You clumsy little beast," Genevieve said, her voice cold and measured. She didn't shout. Genevieve never shouted. Shouting was common, and Genevieve Thornley was many things, but never common. "Do you have any comprehension of what you've destroyed? That decanter was worth more than your entire bloodline." Clarissa stood frozen, her dark eyes huge in her small face, her calico dress spotless because Jacob insisted she keep herself neat when working in the big house. She was 8 years old, bright and quick, learning her letters in secret from an old spelling book Jacob had found discarded in the study. She had her mother's gentle spirit, her mother who had died bringing her into the world, and she had never, in all her short life, raised her hand in anger to any living thing. "Please, mistress," Clarissa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. The table, it wobbled when I was dusting, Anne." Silence. Genevieve's hand shot out and gripped Clarissa's thin arm with fingers that left white pressure marks on the brown skin. "You will learn that carelessness has consequences. Jacob, fetch the orchard rope." The words dropped into Jacob's chest like stones into a well, sinking down and down into darkness. The orchard rope. Everyone on Thornley Plantation knew what the orchard rope meant. Knew about the secluded grove of apple and peach trees on the eastern boundary where Genevieve conducted her special disciplines, where the fruit grew thick and the soil had been fed with more than manure and mulch. "Mistress Genevieve," Jacob said, his voice carefully controlled, every word measured and weighed, "please. She's just a child. She didn't mean no harm. I'll work extra, I'll pay for the decanter however you see fit, but please. Are you questioning me?" Genevieve turned those winter sky eyes on him, and he saw nothing in them. No empathy, no hesitation, nothing but the absolute conviction of someone who believed other human beings were simply objects placed on earth for her convenience. "Are you, a slave, presuming to instruct me on how to manage my property?" The word, property, hung between them like a curse. Clarissa whimpered, trying to pull away from Genevieve's grip, but the mistress's fingers only tightened. "No, ma'am," Jacob forced out. "I wouldn't presume." "Then fetch the rope. And follow us to the orchard. I want you to witness what happens when one's possessions are damaged through negligence." The walk to the blood orchard took 10 minutes that stretched into eternity. Genevieve dragged Clarissa by the arm, her silk skirts swishing through the long grass, her face serene as a portrait. Jacob followed 3 paces behind as protocol dictated, the rough hemp rope burning in his hands, his mind racing through impossible calculations. If he ran with Clarissa, they'd be caught within hours. If he struck Genevieve, he'd be hanged and Clarissa would suffer worse. If he begged, it would only feed her sense of power. There was no way out. The trap had closed the moment the decanter fell. The blood orchard sat in a natural depression surrounded by tall oaks that blocked it from view of the main house and fields. Genevieve had chosen the location deliberately for its privacy. Apple trees planted 20 years ago had grown thick and gnarled, their branches heavy with ripening fruit. Peach trees filled the spaces between, their leaves rustling in the humid breeze. It should have been beautiful. Would have been beautiful, if not for the iron hooks driven into the largest apple tree's trunk, if not for the dark stains on the soil beneath where water and other liquids had been absorbed over years of use. Genevieve released Clarissa only long enough to snatch the rope from Jacob's numb hands. With practiced efficiency, she fashioned a loop, threw it over a high branch, and secured it. Then she stripped a thin branch from a nearby tree, testing its flexibility with a motion that suggested long familiarity. "Hold her," she commanded. Jacob couldn't move. His body had turned to stone, his breath trapped somewhere between his lungs and throat. "I said hold her," Genevieve repeated, her voice sharp now. Or I'll have Rutherford sell her south to the cotton fields. At least there she might learn proper deference. His hands, moving independent of his will, reached for his daughter. Clarissa looked up at him with eyes that held confusion more than fear, still not quite understanding what was about to happen, still believing that her father could fix this, could make it right. "Papa," she whispered. "Close your eyes, baby girl," he managed. "Close your eyes and think about Mama in heaven. Think about the stories I told you about angels." What happened next carved itself into Jacob's memory with such precision that 6 months later he could still recall every detail, the way the branch whistled through the humid air, the sound it made striking his daughter's small back, Clarissa's scream that started high and desperate but grew weaker with each blow. Genevieve's face remained composed throughout, almost meditative, as though she were performing some necessary task like pruning roses or directing the arrangement of flowers. Jacob had been forced to watch everything. 2 overseers had emerged from the trees, summoned by Genevieve earlier, he realized, meaning she'd planned this from the moment the decanter broke. They held his arms, prevented him from moving, made him bear witness as his daughter was beaten beneath the apple trees while bees droned in the flowers and somewhere a mockingbird sang its endless variations. When Clarissa finally stopped moving, stopped crying, stopped breathing, Genevieve stepped back and examined her work with the critical eye of an artist assessing a canvas. A strand of golden hair had come loose from her braids. She tucked it back with fingers that showed not a tremor. "Let this be an object lesson," she said to Jacob, her voice perfectly steady. "Carelessness will not be tolerated on my plantation. Remove the body and bury it in the Negro cemetery. And clean my branch before returning it to the tree. I may have use for it again." She walked away then, her silk skirt swishing through grass already wet with evening dew, leaving Jacob collapsed beneath the apple tree with Clarissa's broken body cradled in his arms. The overseers released him and followed their mistress, their boots loud in the gravel. That night, Rutherford Thornley had come to Jacob's cabin while he sat with Clarissa's body prepared for burial. The master stood in the doorway, his bulk blocking the moonlight, and cleared his throat with the awkwardness of a man confronting something unpleasant but necessary. "Jacob," he said, "I understand there was an incident today. Unfortunate business. The girl was clumsy with valuable property." Jacob had looked up at him with eyes that no longer bothered to hide what they felt. "She was your property to discipline, my dear wife tells me," Rutherford continued, quoting Genevieve's words to him. "These things happen on a plantation. Part of maintaining order. I trust you understand. You've always been sensible, unlike some. I'd hate to lose a butler of your caliber over misplaced sentiment." He'd left $1 on the table, compensation for damaged property, and walked back to the big house where lights blazed warm and welcoming in every window. Jacob buried Clarissa beneath a dogwood tree in the slave cemetery as dawn broke pink and gold over Virginia. He dug the grave himself, refused help, worked until his hands bled and his back screamed. And as he placed his daughter in the earth she would never again walk upon, as he covered her small form with soil that would feed the roots of trees and grass, something inside him had crystallized into a cold, patient purpose. For 3 months, he planned. Watched Genevieve's routines with the meticulous attention he'd always brought to his duties. Learned that she walked to the blood orchard every Wednesday afternoon to inspect the fruit trees and to, as she told Rutherford, ensure the space remains properly maintained for discipline. Noted which paths she took, which times the overseers were occupied elsewhere, how the household schedule created windows of opportunity. He studied butchering techniques during the hog slaughter, asked questions that seemed innocent, learned about cuts and preparation. He researched herbs and cooking methods in Genevieve's own kitchen, experimented with seasonings and temperatures. He became invisible again, just another servant going about his duties, his grief buried so deep that even the other enslaved people stopped offering condolences. And on a Wednesday in late October, when the Virginia air had turned crisp and the blood orchard's trees hung heavy with fruit ready for harvest, Jacob had approached the overseer and reported that he'd seen suspicious figures near the eastern boundary, possibly escaped slaves from a neighboring plantation seeking shelter. Genevieve, always eager for the opportunity to discipline, had taken the bait perfectly. The blood orchard had claimed its mistress that afternoon, beneath the same apple tree where Clarissa had died, and Jacob had made certain that Genevieve understood, in her final moments, exactly why this was happening and who was sending her to whatever judgment awaited. Now, 6 months after Clarissa's murder and 3 weeks after Genevieve's death, Jacob stood in the shadows of the dining room and watched Virginia's finest society consume the woman who had consumed his daughter's life. The debt was not yet fully paid, but he could feel the balance shifting. The Madeira caught the candlelight as Jacob poured, transforming the wine into liquid rubies that filled each crystal glass with hypnotic slowness. His hands remained steady, they had not trembled once all evening, not even when Colonel Pemberton had proclaimed the roast the finest he'd tasted in 3 decades of Virginia dining. "Absolutely exquisite," Mrs. Williams said again, her third such pronouncement since the main course had been served. She had a way of closing her eyes when she chewed, as though the act of tasting required her complete concentration. "There's something almost familiar about the flavor, yet I cannot place it. A sweetness, yes, but also a complexity. Jacob, you must reveal the seasonings." Jacob moved to her side, the wine bottle held with the perfect angle that 15 years of service had perfected. "Rosemary from the mistress's garden, ma'am. Thyme and sage. Some garlic, crushed fine. A touch of honey in the basting. And thyme, ma'am. Proper time in the preparation makes all the difference." Time. Yes, he had given it time. 3 weeks since that October afternoon when he'd led Genevieve into the blood orchard with lies about escaped slaves hiding among the fruit trees. 3 weeks since her eyes had widened in understanding too late, since his hands, these same steady hands now pouring wine, had closed around her throat and squeezed until the panic in her winter sky eyes had faded to nothing. "The marbling is extraordinary," Judge Ashford observed, using his fork to separate a piece on his plate. The meat fell apart with almost no pressure, revealing the delicate streaks of fat that ran through the flesh. "I've never seen such even distribution. It suggests the animal was particularly well fed, perhaps corn-finished." "Something like that, Judge," Rutherford said with evident pride. "Our stock receives excellent care. The quality of the final product reflects the quality of the life lived, wouldn't you say?" Jacob's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that anyone watching carefully might have noticed. The quality of the life lived. Genevieve Thornley had lived a life of absolute privilege and absolute cruelty, had fed on the finest foods and the suffering of others with equal appetite. And now Virginia's elite were literally feeding on her, taking her substance into their own bodies, transforming the woman who had beaten an 8-year-old child to death into energy and tissue and excrement. There was a poetry to it that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrible. "The texture is almost delicate," Reverend Blackwell mused, chewing slowly. "One expects hardiness from such cuts, a certain robustness. But this practically dissolves on the tongue. Extraordinary breeding, Thornley. You must give me the name of your stock supplier." Rutherford laughed, reaching for his wine. "I'm afraid this was a singular specimen, Reverend. One of a kind. There won't be another quite like it." In the shadows by the sideboard, Jacob allowed himself to remember the smokehouse 3 weeks ago. The isolated structure sat beyond the blood orchard, used primarily during autumn hog slaughter, far enough from the main buildings that smoke and smell wouldn't disturb the big house. He had carried Genevieve's body there wrapped in canvas, had laid her on the butchering table where dozens of pigs had been processed over the years. The actual work had taken 2 days. He'd approached it with the same meticulous care he brought to serving the Thornley table, the same attention to detail that had made him invaluable to the household. Butchering was butchering, he'd discovered, whether hog or human, the principles remained largely the same. Find the joints, separate the sections, remove what couldn't be used, preserve what could. Her fine silk dress he'd burned in the smokehouse furnace, watching the imported fabric curl and blacken. Her jewelry, the pearl necklace Rutherford had given her, the gold rings on her fingers, he'd buried deep in the blood orchard soil where so much else had been buried. Her golden hair he'd shorn close to the scalp, fed it to the furnace in handfuls that caught fire like dried grass. And then the careful work of reducing Genevieve Thornley to something useful. "I must know the cooking method," Colonel Pemberton insisted, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. A droplet of juice fell from the meat back to his plate. "Low and slow, obviously, but there's something else. A technique I'm not familiar with. The way the fat has rendered, the caramelization of the exterior while the interior remains tender, it's masterful." Jacob glided forward from the shadows, and perhaps it was the flickering candlelight, but his face seemed different now, the mask of servility replaced by something older and more honest. "Slow roasting, sir. Started at high heat to seal the outside, then dropped the temperature way down. Basted every half hour with the pan drippings mixed with wine and honey. Took near 8 hours in the kitchen oven. 8 hours during which he'd remained alone with his work, the other enslaved servants kept away by his explanation that Master Thornley had requested a special preparation for important guests. 8 hours to tend the roast, to ensure it cooked evenly, to baste it with the herbs from Genevieve's own garden, the same herbs she'd cultivated with such pride, the same garden she'd once ordered a field hand whipped for walking through. The irony had not been lost on him. Nothing was lost on him anymore. Grief had burned away everything except a terrible, crystalline clarity. And the cut itself? Judge Ashford pressed. "I pride myself on recognizing various preparations, but I confess myself stumped. It has qualities of loin, yet also resembles a well-prepared shoulder. Where exactly did this come from? Where exactly?" The loin, primarily, the same part of her body that had moved with such graceful cruelty through the big house, that had bent to select branches for beatings, that had walked away from Clarissa's body without a backward glance. Jacob had separated the primal cuts with a butcher's precision, had selected the choicest portions, had trimmed away what couldn't be served. "From the finest stock on the plantation, sir," Jacob said softly. "Raised right here on Thornley land. Fed from our gardens and orchards. As local as it gets." Mrs. William laughed, dabbing her lips with her napkin. The linen came away stained with meat juice. "You make it sound almost poetic, Jacob. As though we're consuming the very essence of the plantation itself." "Yes, ma'am," Jacob agreed, his dark eyes meeting hers for just a moment. "That's exactly what you're consuming. The very essence." She didn't understand, of course. None of them did. They simply continued eating, continued praising, continued taking Genevieve Thornley into themselves bite by bite. Rutherford had already requested seconds, had already consumed enough of his wife to fill his considerable belly. The colonel had matched him. Even the Reverend, that godly man who preached about divine order and Christian duty every Sunday, had cleaned his plate and accepted another helping. Jacob moved through the room like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, removing empty plates, bringing fresh rolls and butter. His thoughts had taken on a strange, floating quality, as though he were watching himself from a great distance. He observed his own hands placing a clean plate before Mrs. William. Noted his own voice murmuring the appropriate responses when guests addressed him. Registered the growing warmth in his chest that felt almost like peace. In the blood orchard 3 weeks ago, after Genevieve had stopped struggling, after her elegant throat had collapsed beneath his fingers and her winter sky eyes had gone glassy and empty, he had knelt beside her body and spoken to her in a way he'd never been permitted to speak when she was alive. "This is for Clarissa," he'd whispered to her unhearing ears. "For my daughter who died because she was clumsy with your crystal. For every man and woman and child you heard in that orchard. For every scream these trees absorbed. You're going to become nothing, Miss Genevieve. Less than nothing. You're going to be consumed and forgotten, and the only memorial you'll have is in the bellies of people just like you." Then he'd carried her to the smokehouse and begun the work of fulfillment. "A toast," Rutherford announced suddenly, rising from his chair with wine glass raised. He swayed slightly, the Madeira flowing freely all evening, but his voice carried strong and clear. "To prosperity. To Virginia. To the natural order of things that places us at this table, in this house, masters of all we survey." "Here, here," the guests chorused, raising their own glasses. Jacob watched them drink. Watched Rutherford drain his glass and immediately reach for the wine bottle to refill it. The master's face was flushed now, his eyes bright with alcohol and satisfaction. He looked, Jacob thought distantly, rather like a pig at feeding time, all appetite and entitlement, no thought for where the food came from or what it cost. "Jacob," Rutherford called out, "bring out the dessert. Let's end this magnificent meal with equal magnificence." "Yes, master." Jacob retreated to the kitchen where the trifle waited, layers of cream and berries and cakes soaked in sherry. He stood before it for a long moment, his hands flat on the counter, his head bowed. Behind him, he could hear the muffled conversation and laughter from the dining room. In front of him, his own reflection stared back from the polished silver of a serving tray. He looked different, he realized. Older, perhaps. Or maybe just finished, like a task completed, a purpose fulfilled. The man who had entered the blood orchard 3 weeks ago with murder in his heart had emerged transformed, had been rendered down to his essential elements just as surely as Genevieve had been rendered in the smokehouse. When he returned to the dining room bearing the trifle on its crystal pedestal, he found Rutherford studying him with an expression that might have been suspicion or might have been simple drunken confusion. "You've been quiet this evening, Jacob," the master said. "Quieter than usual. Are you unwell?" "No, sir," Jacob replied, setting the dessert in the center of the table where Genevieve would have sat had she been present. "I'm just content. Satisfied with my work." "As well you should be," Colonel Pemberton declared. "This has been the finest meal I've had in years. You're a credit to your master, boy." Jacob inclined his head in acknowledgement, but his eyes found Rutherford's across the candlelit table and held them. For just a moment, something passed between them, a flicker of unease in the master's gaze, a knowing stillness in the servants'. Then Jacob stepped back into the shadows by the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, his face once again a mask of perfect servility. And he watched them eat dessert with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for the main course, watched them consume the sweet finale to a meal 3 weeks in preparation. Let him feast, Jacob thought again, his eyes never leaving Rutherford's face. Let them all feast on what she became. And let him wonder, just a little, why I'm smiling. The guests had retired to the parlor for brandy and cigars, their laughter floating through the hallways like smoke from the candles that guttered low in their silver holders. Jacob moved through the dining room collecting plates, stacking them with methodical precision on a silver tray. Each piece of china clinked softly against the next, a delicate sound that seemed too innocent for what those plates had held. He was wiping down the mahogany table when Rutherford appeared in the doorway, his considerable bulk swaying slightly. The master's face was flushed darker now, his cravat loosened, his eyes carrying that peculiar glassiness that came from too much wine and too much rich food. "Jacob." The single word fell heavy between them. A word. In the butler's pantry. It wasn't a request. Jacob set down his cloth with deliberate care, folded it into a perfect square, and followed his master through the service corridor to the small room where silver was polished and accounts were kept. Rutherford closed the door behind them, an unusual action that made the space feel suddenly smaller, the air thicker. For a long moment, Rutherford simply stared at him. The master's eyes, usually so confident in their authority, now held something else. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or the first stirrings of a dread he didn't yet have words for. "Where is she?" Rutherford asked finally, his voice low. "Where is Genevieve?" "The truth, now." Jacob met his gaze with eyes that no longer pretended deference. 15 years of looking down, of making himself smaller, of reflecting back only what white folks wanted to see, all of it fell away like a discarded coat. What remained was something older and harder and absolutely unafraid. "You want the truth, Master Thornley?" Jacob's voice was soft, almost gentle. "The truth is your wife is exactly where she deserves to be. Where she's been all evening, in fact." "What are you talking about?" Rutherford's hand moved to his waistcoat pocket where he kept a small pistol. Jacob noted the gesture with distant interest but no fear. 3 weeks ago, I took Miss Genevieve to the blood orchard, Jacob said, each word measured and clear. Told her there were escaped slaves hiding in the trees. She came readily enough, you know how she enjoyed the prospect of discipline. How she loved that orchard and what she did there. Rutherford's face had gone pale beneath its wine flush. You're speaking madness. Am I? Jacob tilted his head slightly. Then let me speak more clearly. I killed your wife in the blood orchard, Master Thornley. Killed her under the same apple tree where she beat my Clarissa to death 6 months ago for the crime of breaking your crystal decanter. Choked the life out of her with these hands. He held them up, steady and sure. Watched her eyes go empty the way I watched my daughter's eyes go empty. You, Rutherford staggered back against the counter, his hand closing around the pistol grip. You're lying. You're mad. Genevieve is in Charleston. Genevieve is in your belly, Jacob interrupted, his voice still soft but carrying the weight of absolute truth. And in Colonel Pemberton's belly. And in Judge Ashford's, and the Williams, and the good Reverend Blackwell's. You've been eating her all evening, Master. Every bite you took, every helping you praised, every morsel you declared the finest you'd ever tasted, that was your wife. That was Genevieve. The words hung in the small room like a physical presence. Rutherford's mouth worked silently, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally a dawning comprehension that brought with it a visceral revulsion that bent him double. No, he gasped. No, that's impossible. That was pork, or beef, or... That was Miss Genevieve, Jacob said with terrible patience. I butchered her in the smokehouse beyond the blood orchard. Took 2 days of careful work. Selected the choicest cuts, mainly the loin, some shoulder. Seasoned her with herbs from her own garden, the same rosemary and thyme she was so proud of cultivating. Roasted her slow and low for 8 hours until the meat was so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. Rutherford made a sound, half retch, half moan, and pressed his hand to his mouth. His other hand still gripped the pistol, but he seemed to have forgotten it, his entire being focused on the horror Jacob was methodically laying before him. I basted her with wine from your cellar, Jacob continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational quality. The same Madeira you've been drinking all evening. Added honey for that sweetness Mrs. William kept remarking on. Made sure every detail was perfect, because this meal, this one meal, was going to be my masterwork. 15 years I've served you and yours. 15 years of, yes, master, and no, master, and watching people I loved suffer and die at the whims of their betters. This was going to be perfect. Why? Rutherford whispered, his face now the color of old paste. Why would you, how could you? Because she murdered my child, Jacob said, and now something cracked in his voice, the first sign of emotion breaking through the terrible calm. Because Clarissa was 8 years old and she died screaming for me in the blood orchard while I was held back and forced to watch. Because your wife beat her to death with a tree branch for being clumsy. And because you stood in my cabin that night and told me she was property to discipline and left $1 on the table like that was compensation. Rutherford's legs seemed to give way. He slid down the counter until he was sitting on the floor, his expensive trousers crumpling, his pistol clattering forgotten beside him. His hands trembled as they rose to his face. You fed me my wife, he said, the words muffled behind his palms. You fed me, O God, O Christ. Fed you what she became, Jacob corrected. Fed you the woman who tortured and killed with impunity because she knew she'd never face consequences. Fed you the same substance she fed on, pain and suffering and absolute power over other human beings. You consumed her, Master Thornley. Took her into yourself. Made her part of your own flesh. And now you'll carry her inside you until your body breaks her down into nothing. Into shit, pardon my language. The vulgarity seemed to snap something in Rutherford. He lurched to his feet, grabbing for the pistol, raising it with a shaking hand to point at Jacob's chest. "I'll have you hanged," he gasped. "Drawn and quartered. Burned alive. You'll do whatever you feel you must," Jacob said calmly, looking at the pistol barrel without flinching. "But the deed is done. Your wife is gone. Your distinguished guests have consumed her. You've consumed her. No amount of punishment changes that. No amount of screaming brings her back. She's been reduced to her most basic elements and distributed among Virginia's finest society, and there's not a thing in this world or the next that can undo it." "Why?" Rutherford's voice broke on the word. "Why tell me? Why not just?" "Because you need to know," Jacob said simply. "Because Genevieve died too quick to understand what was happening to her, and that bothered me. I wanted someone to know. To really understand the full weight of what I've done. And who better than you, who enabled her every cruelty, who looked the other way when she dragged my daughter to that orchard?" From the parlor, laughter erupted, the colonel telling some story, by the sound of it. The normalcy of it seemed obscene against the horror unfolding in the butler's pantry. Rutherford's hand was shaking so badly now the pistol wavered in wide arcs. "The guests," he whispered. "They need to know. They need to," he stumbled toward the door. Jacob made no move to stop him. He simply stood in the center of the small room, his hands at his sides, his face bearing an expression that might have been peace or might have been something beyond peace, a completion, a closing of accounts. Rutherford wrenched open the door and staggered into the hallway. Jacob followed at a measured pace, watching as his master lurched toward the parlor, watching as the man's silk-stockinged feet caught on the edge of the Persian runner and sent him sprawling. "She's dead!" Rutherford screamed from the floor, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Genevieve is dead. He fed her to us. Dear God, we ate her." The parlor fell silent. Then came the sound of rapid footsteps, of voices raised in confusion and alarm. Colonel Pemberton appeared first, brandy snifter still in hand, his face creased with concern that transformed to shock as he took in Rutherford's prostrate form. "Thornley, what in heaven's name?" "The roast," Rutherford sobbed, pushing himself to his knees. "The meat we ate. It was Genevieve. It was my wife. He killed her. He butchered her. He fed her to us." The colonel's face went blank with incomprehension. Behind him, the other guests crowded into the hallway, Judge Ashford, the Williams, Reverend Blackwell, all of them staring at their host with expressions that suggested they thought him suddenly mad. "Rutherford, you've had too much wine," Mrs. Williams said uncertainly. "Perhaps you should lie down. Ask him." Rutherford pointed a shaking finger at Jacob, who stood motionless at the end of the hallway, backlit by the dining room's guttering candles. "Ask the bastard what we ate. Ask him what he served us." All eyes turned to Jacob. In that moment, with Virginia's elite society staring at him in confusion and dawning horror, he felt something shift inside his chest, not quite joy, not quite satisfaction, but something profound and final. "It's true," he said quietly into the heavy silence. "Every word Master Thornley says is true. I killed Miss Genevieve Thornley 3 weeks ago in the blood orchard where she murdered my daughter. I butchered her body and prepared it with care. The roast you ate tonight, the meat you praised so highly, was her flesh. Her substance. I fed you Genevieve Thornley, and you consumed her down to the bone. For one hanging moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The confession hung in the air like smoke, like poison, like truth too terrible to be denied. Then Mrs. Williams screamed. The sound broke the paralysis. She doubled over, hands pressed to her mouth, retching violently onto the Persian runner. Her husband staggered backward, his face gone gray-green. Judge Ashford sank against the wall, his eyes wide and staring. The Reverend clutched his Bible, pulled from his coat pocket, and began praying in a strangled whisper. And Colonel Pemberton, practical military man that he was, pulled a pistol from his own waistcoat and aimed it squarely at Jacob's heart. "Monster," he breathed. Jacob met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. I expect I am. But my daughter is avenged. And Miss Genevieve got exactly what she deserved. Dawn broke over Thornley Plantation in shades of pearl and rose gold, the Virginia sky transforming from black to gray to that particular luminous blue that promised another humid day. Jacob sat with his back against the stone wall of the smokehouse, his hands bound with the same rope that had once been used in the blood orchard, his ankles shackled with iron that had been hastily retrieved from the overseer's stores. He had not slept. Had not tried to. The night had passed in a strange suspension of time, punctuated by the sounds of guests departing in panicked haste, carriages rattling down the drive at speeds that endangered horses and passengers alike. Mrs. Williams continued retching, the Reverend's prayers growing hoarse and desperate as the hours wore on. 2 overseers stood guard over him now, their faces carefully blank in the way of men witnessing something beyond their comprehension. They had not beaten him, had not even spoken to him beyond the necessary commands to move here, sit there, keep silent. Perhaps they feared him now in a way they never had before. Or perhaps they simply didn't know what to do with a slave who had done the unthinkable and admitted it without remorse. The blood orchard was visible from where he sat, a dark cluster of trees perhaps 200 yards distant. As the light grew stronger, Jacob could make out the gnarled branches of the apple trees, heavy now with fruit that no one would harvest. The peach trees between them still held their leaves despite the lateness of the season, deep green against the morning sky. Clarissa was buried beyond those trees, in the slave cemetery where a simple wooden cross marked her resting place. He had carved her name himself, had placed wildflowers on the fresh earth every week until Genevieve's death had consumed all his attention. "I done it, baby girl," he whispered, so softly the guards couldn't hear. "I done what needed doing." Footsteps crunched on gravel. Jacob didn't turn his head, but he felt the presence before he saw it, Rutherford Thornley, his master for 15 years, approaching with the slow, heavy tread of a man who hadn't slept either. The master's face looked ravaged in the early light, his eyes sunken and red-rimmed, his expensive clothes rumpled and stained. "Leave us," Rutherford said to the overseers. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "Sir, are you certain?" one began. "Leave us." They retreated to a respectful distance but remained within shouting range, their hands on their weapons. Rutherford stood over Jacob for a long moment, staring down at him with an expression too complex to parse, horror and hatred certainly, but also something that might have been terrible understanding. "The sheriff is coming," Rutherford said finally. "He'll be here by mid-morning. There will be a trial, though it's merely a formality. You'll hang before sunset." "Yes, sir," Jacob said calmly. "I expect I will." "Is that all you have to say?" Rutherford's voice rose, cracking. "No plea for mercy? No begging?" "No. No, sir." Jacob looked up at him, his dark eyes clear and untroubled. "I knew the cost when I started. Knew what would happen once truth came out. I ain't asking for mercy I don't deserve and wouldn't accept if offered." Rutherford made a sound like a wounded animal and turned away, his hand pressed to his mouth. For several minutes he stood like that, his back to Jacob, his shoulders shaking with either sobs or dry heaves, Jacob couldn't tell which. "I loved her," Rutherford said finally, his voice muffled. "Despite everything, despite her nature, I loved Genevieve. And you made me, you forced me to," he couldn't finish. "I forced you to consume what she was," Jacob said quietly. "To take her cruelty into yourself. To make it part of your body. Maybe that's fitting, Master Thornley. Maybe you should carry her inside you, seeing as how you carried her cruelty all those years, enabled it, profited from it. She was my wife. And Clarissa was my daughter." Jacob's voice remained steady, but something harder entered it now. 8 years old and beaten to death for breaking glass. "You remember that, Master? You remember standing in my cabin and telling me she was property to discipline? Leaving a dollar like that settled accounts?" Rutherford turned back, his face twisted. "She was a slave child. Genevieve was. Was what? Worth more. More human. More deserving of life. Jacob shook his head slowly. That's what you people never understand. We bleed the same. We hurt the same. We love our children just as fierce as you love yours. Clarissa was my whole world, and your wife took her from me because she could. Because nothing and no one ever told her she couldn't. So you took everything from me. Rutherford's voice was bitter. I took what was owed, Jacob corrected. An eye for an eye, like the good book says. Your Reverend Blackwell preaches that, don't he? Divine justice and righteous retribution. A long silence fell between them, broken only by birdsong from the blood orchard and the distant lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. The plantation was waking around them, the enslaved workforce beginning their daily labors, though word of the previous night's horror had already spread in the way news always spread among those who lived at the mercy of white people's madness. I have one request, Jacob said finally. Before the hanging. Rutherford laughed, sharp and bitter. You have the audacity to request. Let me walk in the blood orchard, Jacob interrupted. One last time. Let me see where my daughter died and where your wife paid for killing her. Let me stand under those trees before I hang from a rope. Why? Why would I grant you anything? Jacob met his eyes. Because you know, deep down, that what I did was justice. Might not be legal justice, might not be Christian justice, but it was justice all the same. And because you'll spend the rest of your life carrying the weight of what you ate last night, and maybe, just maybe, granting a dying man's final request will lighten that burden by a fraction. Rutherford stared at him for a long time, his jaw working. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the overseers, spoke to them briefly, and gestured toward the blood orchard. They came and hauled Jacob to his feet, unlocked the ankle shackles so he could walk, kept his hands bound and their rifles ready. The small procession made its way across the dew-wet grass toward the grove of fruit trees, Rutherford leading, Jacob in the middle flanked by guards, the morning sun climbing higher with each step. The blood orchard hadn't changed. The same gnarled trees, the same iron hooks driven into the largest apple trunk, the same dark soil beneath where water and blood had fed the roots for years. But something felt different now, quieter, perhaps. More peaceful. As though the violence the place had witnessed had finally been answered, some cosmic balance restored. Jacob moved to the base of the apple tree where Clarissa had died, where he had held her broken body and wept until no tears remained. The guards allowed him to kneel, his bound hands resting on his knees, his head bowed. I done it, baby, he whispered. The woman who hurt you, she paid full price. She ain't never gonna hurt nobody else. I know I'm coming to meet you soon, and I ain't afraid. Waited 6 months to set things right, and now it's finished. Now I can rest. A breeze moved through the orchard, rustling leaves and setting the fruit to swaying on their branches. And then something extraordinary happened, something the guards would talk about in hushed voices for years after, something that would become legend among the enslaved community and horror story among the whites. The apple blossoms began to bloom. It was November, long past blooming season, the trees already heavy with ripened fruit. But as Jacob knelt beneath the tree, white petals began to unfurl from buds that shouldn't have existed, spreading across the branches in a wave of impossible spring. And as they opened fully, they transformed, white bleeding to pink, pink deepening to crimson, until the entire tree was covered in blossoms the color of fresh blood. Sweet Jesus, one of the guards whispered, taking a step back. The crimson blossoms spread to the neighboring trees, jumping from branch to branch like fire, until the entire blood orchard blazed with flowers that defied season and nature. They fell in drifts around Jacob's kneeling form, carpeting the dark soil in red petals that looked disturbingly like scattered drops of blood. Jacob raised his head and looked up through the impossible blooms, his face peaceful, almost radiant. Thank you, he said softly, though whether he spoke to God or to his daughter or to some other power entirely, no one could say. Rutherford had gone pale, his eyes wide with superstitious dread. Get him out of here, he ordered, his voice shaking. "Get him out now." The guards hauled Jacob to his feet and hurried him from the orchard, practically dragging him in their haste to escape the unnatural phenomenon. But Jacob went willingly, his eyes on the crimson blooms that continued to spread and fall, his lips moving in silent words that might have been prayer or might have been farewell. Behind them, the blood orchard blazed like a wound in the Virginia landscape, its impossible flowers visible for miles, a testament, a warning, a reminder that some debts could only be paid in blood and bone and the transformation of flesh into something both terrible and true. As they locked Jacob back in the smokehouse to await the sheriff and the noose, he settled against the wall with a profound sense of completion. The guards retreated farther than before, watching the still-blooming orchard with fearful eyes, making signs against evil that their grandmothers had taught them. Jacob closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember Clarissa's laugh, the way she'd looked up at him with absolute trust, the weight of her small hand in his. He'd avenged her. Had made the woman who killed her into nothing, less than nothing. Had fed her to the people who'd enabled her cruelty, had reduced her to waste and memory. The cost was his life, but that seemed small compared to what he'd gained, the knowledge that his daughter's death had been answered, that justice, dark and terrible justice, but justice nonetheless, had finally been served. When the sheriff came with his rope and his righteous anger, Jacob would go to the gallows willingly. He had done what needed doing. The rest was just finishing. 5 years passed like water through cupped hands, and Thornley Plantation fell into the kind of ruin that speaks of more than mere neglect, a decay born of something fundamental breaking in the land itself. Rutherford Thornley lasted 18 months after Jacob's execution. The guests who had consumed that unholy meal never spoke to him again, their silence more damning than any accusation. Colonel Pemberton left Virginia entirely, selling his holdings at a loss and moving to Philadelphia where no one knew what he'd eaten that October evening. Judge Ashford took to drink and died choking on his own vomit in a Charleston boarding house. The Williams marriage dissolved in mutual recrimination and madness. Only Reverend Blackwell remained, but his sermons grew increasingly unhinged, his congregation dwindling until he preached to empty pews about divine punishment and the wages of sin. Rutherford himself descended into a peculiar form of insanity. He could not eat meat, any meat, without retching violently. Bread and water sustained him poorly, and he wasted away inside his mansion like a man being consumed from within. The enslaved workers reported hearing him wandering the halls at night, weeping and calling Genevieve's name, asking forgiveness from a ghost that never answered. When he finally died, the doctor listed the cause as a failure of the heart, but those who had seen him at the end knew better. He had died of horror, of the inescapable knowledge of what he had consumed and what that consumption meant. They buried him in the family plot beside an empty grave marked with Genevieve's name, empty because her body had never been recovered, had been scattered across the digestive systems of Virginia's elite and reduced to waste expelled in chamber pots and outhouses. The irony was not lost on those who had once been her property. With Rutherford's death, the plantation passed to a distant cousin who took one look at the books, at the blood orchard with its crimson blossoms that bloomed year-round regardless of season, and at the reputation that hung over the place like a curse. He sold it within a month to speculators who planned to subdivide the land. But no buyer materialized. No one wanted to build on soil that had witnessed such horrors, that had absorbed so much blood and suffering. The main house stood empty, its windows like blind eyes, its doors hanging open to admit weather and animals. Possessions were looted by locals who later claimed the stolen items brought bad luck, silver that tarnished overnight, furniture that seemed to hold whispers, clothing that smelled of smoke no matter how often it was washed. The enslaved population was sold off to neighboring plantations, scattered like seeds on the wind. But word of what had happened spread among them, carried in the careful oral tradition of people who had no written history but remembered everything. Jacob Brennan's story became legend, the man who had exacted the ultimate revenge, who had fed a mistress to her peers, who had died on the gallows with dignity and no regret. And the blood orchard itself became something else entirely. At first, only the brave or the desperate approached it. An old woman named Temperance, who had lost 3 children to Genevieve's cruelties, was the first. She came at dawn with a handful of wildflowers picked from the roadside and placed them at the base of the apple tree where Clarissa had died. She knelt in the carpet of crimson petals, still falling, still impossible, still blood-red, and whispered prayers for all the children taken too soon. When she returned to her own plantation, her overseer found her temperament so changed, so peacefully resolved, that he reported it to his master with concern. But Temperance only smiled and said she'd found absolution in the strangest place. Others followed. Men and women from plantations across Albemarle County made secret pilgrimages to the blood orchard, always at dawn or dusk when they might slip away unnoticed. They left flowers, small stones, strips of fabric torn from clothing. They knelt beneath the crimson blossoms and spoke names aloud, names of children beaten, of fathers sold away, of mothers worked to death, of all the losses that the peculiar institution demanded and never acknowledged. The blood orchard became an unauthorized memorial, a place where the enslaved could bring their grief and rage and have it witnessed by something larger than themselves. The trees themselves seemed to respond, their impossible blooms growing thicker, their fruit, which no one ever harvested, glowing with an inner light that was visible even at midnight. Local whites grew increasingly superstitious about the place. Stories spread of ghostly figures seen among the trees, of voices singing spirituals when no one was present, of the smell of cooking meat that wafted from the abandoned smokehouse though no fire burned there. Travelers avoided the road past Thornley Plantation, choosing longer routes rather than past the blood orchard after dark. A young minister named Samuel, born into slavery on a neighboring plantation, began incorporating the story into his clandestine sermons. He spoke of Jacob not as a murderer but as an instrument of divine justice, a man who had taken upon himself the terrible burden of retribution when no earthly power would intervene. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Samuel would preach to small gatherings hidden in tobacco barns and root cellars. Sometimes his justice comes not from heaven but from the hands of the oppressed. Sometimes the meek inherit the earth by taking it back one act of righteous fury at a time. The white authorities, had they known of such sermons, would have hanged Samuel alongside Jacob. But the enslaved community kept their secrets well, and Samuel's word spread like underground fire, carried from plantation to plantation by those who needed to believe that their suffering would someday be answered. 10 years after Jacob's execution, a young girl named Hope, 12 years old and already bearing the scars of her mistress's discipline, ran away from a plantation 30 miles distant. She made her way to the blood orchard, guided by stories she'd heard whispered in the quarters, and hid among the trees for 3 days while search parties combed the countryside. The crimson blossoms fell around her like blessings. The fruit, which should have been inedible after so many years without tending, tasted sweet and sustained her until she could make her way north to the underground railroad stations that were just beginning to form in Virginia. Years later, after the war had come and gone and left the South in ruins, Hope returned as a free woman. She found the blood orchard still standing, still blooming its impossible flowers, though the main house had collapsed and the fields had returned to wilderness. She knelt beneath the same apple tree where Clarissa had died, where Jacob had prayed before his execution, and she wept, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming weight of survival and freedom. "Thank you," she whispered to the trees, to the memory of a man she'd never met but whose act of desperate justice had given her the courage to claim her own freedom. "Thank you for showing us that we could fight back. That we mattered enough to be avenged." The wind moved through the branches, rustling leaves and scattering crimson petals that caught the afternoon light. And for just a moment, though Hope would never be entirely certain if it was real or imagined, she heard the sound of a child's laughter mixing with the deeper tones of a man's voice, both of them at peace, both of them finally, impossibly, free. By the turn of the century, the blood orchard had become local folklore, the story sanitized and romanticized by white historians who couldn't quite bring themselves to acknowledge the horror at its heart. They wrote of a tragic incident and a mad servant and the unfortunate outcome of inadequate discipline, their words bleaching out the truth the way sun bleaches bone. But the black families who had survived slavery and its aftermath told different stories to their children and grandchildren. They spoke of Jacob Brennan with a reverence usually reserved for saints and martyrs. They taught that sometimes love demands terrible prices, that justice wears many faces, and that the oppressed have always found ways, dark ways, desperate ways, to reclaim their humanity from those who would deny it. The Blood Orchard stood for another 50 years, its crimson blossoms blooming through world wars and depressions, through the slow, painful progress towards something that might someday resemble justice. Botanists came to study it, puzzled by the year-round flowering, by the deep red pigmentation that defied genetic explanation. They took samples and wrote papers, but none of their science could explain what the trees had become, a living memorial to suffering answered, to cruelty repaid, to the terrible algebra of revenge that sometimes balances books that law and society refuse to audit. Eventually, even the trees succumbed to time and weather, their trunks hollowing, their branches falling, their roots finally releasing their grip on the blood-soaked soil. But the land itself remained changed, marked by what it had witnessed. Wildflowers that grew there came up crimson even when they should have been white or yellow. The soil held a darkness that no amount of tilling could lighten. And on certain mornings, when the mist rose thick from the Virginia ground and the light came slanting through at just the right angle, people swore they could still see the Blood Orchard standing, phantom trees bearing impossible flowers, and beneath them the shade of a man kneeling in prayer beside the ghost of a child whose laughter echoed across a century of silence. The story of Jacob Brennan and Genevieve Thornley passed into history, but it never quite became past. It remained present, a dark seed planted in the American consciousness, a reminder that the violence of slavery did not flow in only one direction, that the oppressed sometimes found terrible ways to speak when all other voices were stolen from them. And in the place where the Blood Orchard once stood, where crimson petals once fell like rain and impossible flowers once bloomed in defiance of season and sense, there remained a truth that the land itself remembered. Some debts can only be paid in flesh and blood. Some justice can only be served cold. And some stories, no matter how dark, deserve to be told and remembered, not because they comfort us, but because they remind us of the human cost of cruelty, and the lengths to which love and grief can drive even the gentlest soul when everything they cherish is taken away. The orchard remembers. The land remembers. And we must remember too. If this macabre tale left you haunted, subscribe for more dark historical horror stories. Comment below which disturbing chapter of history I should uncover next. Your engagement brings these buried tales to light.